Hello, thank you so much to the Historic Brass Society for giving me this platform to present my research. Before I begin, I must acknowledge that accounts of the gentlemen that I will be outlining exist because of their affiliations with white enslavers, white clergymen, and white aristocracy, who have included them in or facilitated their written and oral histories. The experiences of each one of these men represents countless others who were not affiliated with the likes of George Washington or Frederick, Prince of Wales. It has been eye-opening for me to discover the information that I'm going to share, and I hope that it inspires you to search for more lost voices of the brass world. Unlike the courtly trumpet and angelic trombone, the horn was not affiliated with aristocracy and privilege until the 17th century. We can see that there were trumpeters of color in the courts by the 16th century. This is a depiction of John Blank, a famous trumpeter in the court of Henry VIII. This comes from the Westminster Tournament Roll of 1511. And this depiction comes from a royal celebration panel in Lisbon from 1522. Hunting horn was being used in the court of Versailles in 1664. It was transplanted to Bohemia in 1681 and brought to the American colonies at some point before 1747, by which time Thomas, 6th Lord Fairfax, had established hunting parties in Virginia. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as well were both avid hunters, and Washington especially was well known for his hunting parties. Both men represented elegance to lay colonists, and they aspired to cultivate a non-monarchical equivalent to European aristocracy. In 1778, Thomas Jefferson had attempted to procure horn-playing indentured or enslaved servants for Monticello as a band of harmony music. Washington had enslaved at least one hunting horn player at Mount Vernon from around 1767. Both men, Washington and Jefferson, were emulating or attempting to emulate European practices of the time, with the important distinction that by the late 18th century, the American colonies were embracing slavery and moving away from indentured servitude, and European countries were moving away from slavery and toward indentured servitude. At the bottom left of this painting, we can see Cato, who was in the early and mid 18th century the huntsman to Frederick, the Prince of Wales, heir apparent to the British throne, and possibly to his son, George III. Cato was highly regarded in hunting circles, so much so that he was included in this portrait of hunting celebrities. Cato presents an important example that people of color are often both visible yet unseen in history. He performed both on the field and in ensemble settings, and in that respect he is an immensely important figure in horn history, regardless of race or service status, as he represents the transitional phase between huntsman hornist and orchestral hornist. Domestic servants, indentured servants, and enslaved persons who could play the horn, fiddle, and flute were in demand in both England and the American colonies. The horn was used in the hunt for both signaling and field music, as well as providing music for social occasions. Wherever there was dancing and music, there was apt to be an enslaved musician playing the fiddle or a horn for the dancers. Horn teachers in the colonies were advertised in American newspapers as early as 1736. It was common for enslaved people to accompany their enslavers to college and sit with them during lessons and classes. Some may have learned to play their instruments this way. Others may have learned in an apprenticeship. Despite the laws against the education of enslaved and in some states free people of African descent, profiteering American enslavers would exploit the skills of enslaved people and provide them with a trade. A glance through colonial-era newspapers shows that a large number of enslaved people had skill at playing the horn. I found over 50 such advertisements in my research, some for buying, some for selling, and many runaway ads. While we can never know how enslaved people and domestic servants felt about their forced status as musicians, insight can be gleaned through the literary genre of slave narratives. Olaudah Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano is considered to be the seminal slave narrative. He was purchased and sold several times during the first part of his life and spent the second half as a free man. One of his enslavers had been a British naval officer who wanted him to learn to play the French horn in Virginia while he went to fight in the French and Indian War. Equiano preferred to accompany him on his ship to the French and Indian War rather than remain in Virginia. Eventually, he was able to purchase his freedom from his final enslaver, who was Quaker, and he moved to London where he learned to play the horn of his own volition. He was not coerced or forced into performance, and from Equiano's narrative, it seems that he was genuinely skilled as a horn player. He took lessons from his horn player neighbor, who was probably either William Rogers or James Salkeld, at Covent Garden or Westminster Abbey. Equiano described playing the horn as his chief comfort. He was a dedicated abolitionist, and I think very likely he knew and performed music written by Ignatius Sancho, another African-born musician living in London. Many of Sancho's pieces were written with obligato horn parts, this minuet included. Equiano's 1789 narrative is widely considered to be the first published slave narrative, but in 1785, a man named John Marrant presented a speech in London during his ordination as a preacher. Interestingly enough, Marrant was another highly accomplished French horn player. John Marrant was born free in New York and moved to South Carolina with his mother when he was around 10 years old. As he was walking past a school in Charleston, he heard the sound of musicians practicing and ran home to ask his mother how he could learn to play music. Because he was free, his mother was able to pay the schoolmaster for lessons, and by the age 13, he was gainfully employed as an indentured servant musician, performing for dances and other social occasions. John Marrant's relationship with the horn is complicated. He was moved by the call to music, and as a free person, he was able to pursue it as a profession so long as he was employed in the service of white men. He was conscripted to perform in the only legal way available to him, and also in some illegal ways. The South Carolina Negro Act of 1740 was only one of the so-called Negro Codes in the American South, which declared that all people of color, quote, Negro, Indian, mulatto, mestizo, end quote, were categorized as a slave on the basis of their skin color unless evidence could be provided that they were free, and the evidence was corroborated by 3 white people. The laws made it illegal for groups of people of color to gather, learn to write, own property, and grow food. If Marrant's indenture required him to perform on the horn or fiddle with people of color, then he was being contracted to break the law and had no power to refuse. Even though he was free, John Marrant's skill on the fiddle and horn was exploited by people with power over his livelihood, who oppressed his musical voice and controlled his freedom and body. John Marrant is most well known for his first experience with religion when he entered a church intending to disrupt the sermon by blowing loudly on his horn as a prank. He was then struck down by the Lord and rendered senseless for nearly half an hour. After this experience, Marrant decided to dedicate himself to the service of God and the church, spending time in London before he was assigned to a church in Nova Scotia. During the Revolutionary War, before he moved to London, he served as a musician for the British Army. It was common for Black Americans to serve the British Army until General Washington agreed to grant freedom to enslaved persons who enlisted for the Continental Army in 1776. I don't know whether John Marrant played in a British band as well as on his own on the British naval ships, but as the Revolutionary War began, horn players were used in military music in the British and American armies. Harmony music in colonial America grew out of the French and British military traditions, and the information that exists supports the idea that the horn was used in a morale boosting function during the war. I think it quite likely that American huntsmen were given signaling duties during the War for Independence, Revolutionary War, on bugles as well as on hunting horns. They would have used whatever instruments they could find. When hunting parties took place on early American estates, enslaved persons would often perform the duties of huntsmen. The injustice of slavery is worsened by the symbolism of the horn as an emblem of the aristocratic hunt. When coupled with the sentiments toward people of color, we must recognize that enslaved huntsmen were not seen as people, but as livestock property, and the horn signal served to inflate the importance of these early American aristocrats. George Washington's huntsman was a man named William Lee. Similar to Cato's association with the Prince of Wales, what little is written about Lee exists because of his affiliation with Washington, so it reads from a perspective that's disconnected from William Lee's true experience as an enslaved Black American. We know from the purchase record that William Lee was mixed race. The law stated that a child born to an enslaved woman was born into slavery regardless of paternity. Because of this, we can assume that William Lee was the progeny of a sexual assault from a white enslaver upon an enslaved woman. Lee is included in several paintings of Washington, including Leutze's famous depiction of Washington's crossing of the Delaware. William Lee's duties extended far beyond those of a typical European huntsman. He was at Washington's side before, during, and after the American Revolutionary War. And as a body servant, Lee was essentially the United States' first Secret Service agent. The sport of fox hunting is built so that the master of the hunt and the huntsman work in synchrony, and that relationship built a level of trust between George Washington and William Lee that was unusual for that time between an enslaver and an enslaved person. Washington had placed purchase orders for hunting horns no less than 4 times and was possibly gifted a horn by the Marquis de Lafayette. The horn pictured here currently resides at Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate. This horn was made by an 18th century British hornmaker named George Henry Rodenbostel, and it was given to the estate in 1906 by the family of Dr. Elisha Dick, who had attended to Washington on his deathbed. There's no evidence to support or disprove the claim that this was, in fact, Washington's horn, and there's no reason to think that Washington himself would have played the horn, which leads to the conclusion that any horns that were purchased, possibly this one included, were purchased for use by William Lee. It can be assumed that William Lee never rode again after 1785, both because it was the year of Washington's last fox hunt, and also because Lee incurred injuries to his kneecaps, which would have made it nearly impossible for him to ride horses. I was unable to find any evidence to indicate that Lee ever performed concert music on a horn at Mount Vernon, but I wouldn't be surprised if Washington had heard of Cato and intended for William Lee to fill that position in his entourage. George Washington was notoriously aspirational, superficial, and focused on presenting an image of wealth and aristocracy that he expected those in his household to uphold. Without commentary from William Lee himself, it's impossible to know whether playing the horn symbolized servitude or represented something pleasing to him. If he had expressed an interest in learning to play concert music, the relationship between the two men was such that Washington would likely have attempted to accommodate that request. William Lee was the only enslaved person to be granted freedom upon George Washington's death. William Lee died in 1810 and was laid to rest in the unmarked slave grave at Mount Vernon. He is the only enslaved person who historians can say is buried in that plot, though countless more were buried there. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm very happy to take questions now.